Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's session on creating self-service analytic BI applications with Microsoft SharePoint 2010. My name is Peter Myers. I'm a mentor with a Microsoft Gold partner called SolidQ. I've worked in the business intelligence space for a number of years, and of recent have been getting rather experienced with the SharePoint BI side of the story. I come very much from the SQL Server BI space. And it's been a very interesting journey becoming familiar with what SharePoint Business Intelligence can deliver. So I'm here today to talk to you about the business intelligence capabilities of SharePoint 2010. I have about 14 years experience working with Microsoft products and more recently about 3 to 4 years working with SharePoint. So the agenda is to introduce the BI capabilities. We'll start briefly by talking about what is the Business Intelligence Center to kickstart your development of a site to support business intelligence. We'll talk about this chart and status list web parts, and then we'll focus on the service applications that are delivered with the Enterprise Edition of SharePoint 2010, specifically Excel services, Performance Point services, and Visio services. And then finally, we'll talk about the integration scenarios we have with other SQL Server products, reporting services, and Power Pivot. So introducing business intelligence for SharePoint 2010, it's delivered as a suite of components and service applications to deliver BI to drive decision-making processes. And it emphasizes familiar interfaces, definitely self-service capabilities and interactive experiences. So very much here we're targeting the information workers within your organization to empower them to create their own business intelligence solutions. So it benefits a number of different groups within the organization. It helps all of you people become decision makers, improves the company's efficiency, and no doubt makes IT more efficient. Do appreciate that most of what's discussed today, in particular the service applications, are delivered only with the Enterprise Edition. And when we take a look at the different audiences, the IT professionals still have some role to play here, in that they'll install and configure the applications. Perhaps they will develop, secure, and manage business data sources. And this is the important one. They'll go ahead and delegate business data development tasks to those that need to do it most. So this is offloading of responsibilities and tasks to those out there in the field that have the interest and perhaps the expertise to go ahead and produce such solutions. Importantly, they will monitor usage and server impact to ensure that the server is responding appropriately to requests. And then the focus is on power users, analysts, and developers that really is the target audience for today, about empowering them to publish workbooks, diagrams, dashboards, and reports, and to assemble dashboard pages within SharePoint. And notably, what you'll discover in today's demonstrations is there's no need to know how to write queries or any code to produce some sophisticated solutions. Finally, to deliver to the information workers, well, their job's easy. Providing they have permission, they're just going to navigate to the resources that you publish, and they'll help themselves by viewing, exporting, or potentially subscribing to reports. So starting with the Business Intelligence Center, this is a site template that can kickstart your endeavors into the BI space. So it delivers a one-stop shop for reporting and analytic solutions. It includes a dashboards library, data connections library, documents library, and a library, or a list rather, for storing performance point content. So to me, this is a starting point. It kickstarts the site. I often then extend it with extra libraries to support the additional capabilities I expect from that site. Starting with the chart web part, this is a really easy way to introduce data visualization into a web part page. So it supports configuring a chart without the need to develop code or write any query. Includes a comprehensive list of chart types that I've included here on the very right. And data can be retrieved from other web parts cited on the same page, data stored in SharePoint lists, the business data catalog, or Excel services. And a menu allows users to modify data in appearance and configure advanced properties, and you can introduce filter web parts to support the filtering to interact with the chart. So let's switch across to demonstration. Before me here I have the AdventureWorks BI site that's started with that site template, so it's pretty much a BI center that's been extended to include additional libraries and lists. Let me point out up front that there are a number of data connections already defined, so I see this very much as the administrator's job to go ahead and define, approve, and secure data sources for use in the activities that I'm going to demonstrate to you today. Starting point for this demonstration is to go ahead and create a new web part page. And what I love about SharePoint is that I can become a web developer without the need to write any code. And here I go ahead and create a new page that will be called Sales Quotas. And I'll choose a template of a header, a left column, and a body. And there's the creation of a web part page. Now let me just point out to you before I proceed with its development that I have this list down here of sales quotas broken down by year, country, and the value of the quota. So my intention here is to build up a bar chart and allow users to filter by year to appreciate the quotas expected to be achieved by each country. So back to my web part page, and I'll go ahead and edit and simply introduce a web part into the body. From the business data, I have a chart web part. And so these web parts are pretty cool. They're pre-packaged functionality just waiting to be added to a page and to be configured. And so very straightforward. Once it's been added to the page, I just click here to manage its data and appearance. And then I can click here, connect chart to data. And in this example, we'll connect to a list. And then I select the sales quotas. And then it presents to me the data for preview. Now my intention is to support filtering by year, so I'm going to create a filter here on the year field, which I've set up to be a string, and I'm going to default to the fiscal year of 2010. So I can now preview that subset of the list to see that I have 4 countries with their quotas. And now I can move next and say, well, let's put the country on the x-axis, the quota on the y-axis. It's very, very comprehensive, actually. There's lots and lots of properties that I don't have time to go through today, but one that I'll point out is that I'm going to place the quota itself on a tooltip so we can hover over the bar to see the actual value. And that completes the configuration of the chart. And so what we see at the moment is a bar chart for that default year of 2010. And so I'm going to return to editing the page, and here in the left column, in order to prompt users for what year of interest, I'm going to introduce the choice filter web part. And click on this link to configure the web part. And I'm simply going to call this year. And the available values will be my years to 2012. In the advanced options, I will default to 2010, allow multiple selection, and then also provide a title that it will be called year, and a width of 120 pixels. Again, note the need for no code. So the last part then to complete this page is to define a connection that will allow that filter selection to be passed across to the chart web part. And recall that I filtered the set of data by the column that was year. And so all of the filters that I define on the list are available here as endpoints for filter values to be passed into. And now when I stop editing the page, we have this ability to say, well, let's take a look at 2011. And voila. That's the chart web part. Very, very simple to connect to existing data stores and present that data graphically. A second web part of interest to business intelligence is the status list web part that supports introducing status indicators. We're in the realm of monitoring here, so KPIs. SharePoint lists, Excel services, analysis services KPIs, or even fixed values can be used to define these statuses. And they can also be filtered by filter web parts. Now, this is one that I choose not to demonstrate. In fact, I prefer to de-emphasize the fact that this web part even exists, because we'll discover shortly that Performance Point Services, a service application that comes with SharePoint 2010 Enterprise, is far more sophisticated when it comes to defining KPIs and presenting them in a dashboard. So we'll come back to this concept about producing status lists later on. Excel services, a favorite topic of mine, supports the server-side calculation and browser-based rendering of Excel workbooks. So it's really the old approach, in my opinion, that we should develop Excel workbooks that contain data or connect to external data and then present that data through pivot tables and other reports. It's a bad practice these days, I think, that we take those workbooks, attach them to emails and start distributing them around the organization. We have the issue of version control. We have the issue of also security, that what's not to say that that workbook, its data, the intellectual property contained within that workbook could somehow get outside the organization. So the appropriate way to manage the distribution and sharing of workbook data and workbook intellectual property is to publish it to SharePoint, secure it appropriately, and then users make requests via URL. And this will engage Excel services to load the workbook, query the data sources, recalculate the workbook, produce an HTML representation of it, and then send it back down to the browser. So it's useful when users need to share content in a workbook with others, use it for real-time interactive reporting with support for parameterization, expose all or part of a workbook, so intellectual property can be hidden, and use it to develop analytical solutions. There is a web part that will support the embedding of Excel workbooks directly into web part pages, and let's take a look at that in demonstration. So the first thing I'll point out to you is in the Data Connections library, there's an Office data connection here that connects to the reseller sales cube for the AdventureWorks company. So this has already been set up. It's been approved by administrators. And so as the end user or this information worker, I come across to the Insert ribbon tab, and I just start by inserting a pivot table. And the selection here to choose an external data source, and then to browse to that Data Connections library, and then select that Office Data Connection file. So I should never need to know where that server is, what the name of the database and cube is. It's already been defined and published. It's a matter of just reaching out and then adding it to the current workbook. So I make the selection for the ODC file. And very patiently wait for it to open. There's a lot installed on this, the virtual machine I'm demonstrating from. So it's quite unusual. You'd find that your database server, your SharePoint farm, and your end user productivity tools are all installed on the same machine. So be a little patient with the demonstrations I have. So we're going to place that pivot table in this location. And so what we see is the addition of the pivot table, and here on the right side is the pivot table field list that exposes to me the structure of the model consisting of measures broken down by the measure groups of reseller sales and sales quota. There's also a KPI defined inside the cube, and then dimensions that include hierarchies for date, product, the reseller, and the salespeople. And so I'll commence by introducing the fiscal hierarchy to become a report filter. So this will allow me to filter data in the pivot table. And let me introduce then from the reseller sales measure group that I want to analyze sales amount and profitability. Okay, I like to come into the value field settings and rename the fields to become simply sales. Profit and profit percent. And then to provide some context around those measures, let me introduce the products hierarchy to the row labels. So you might note immediately that we've got some red values coming back, and I think that's really cool because the Cube developer has built in rules about presentation of data also, and Excel is honoring that by formatting and also coloring the data when it's negative. And so we have interactivity capabilities here to expand down within the categories and subcategories to reveal this data. So appreciate that the Excel client is querying direct to the Cube to deliver live data. Now, another cool capability introduced in Excel 2010 is the ability to insert slices. So I might also want to slice by the country of the reseller. And now I can take a look at what happened in Australia I can filter by the first quarter of 2011, and then understand what the sales were. I also like to point out the conditional formatting that you have here to provide this distribution of values. All right. So that's great. I can connect to data, I can create a reporting experience, but now the challenge is how do I effectively share this with other users, with other colleagues in my department? So what I'm going to do is publish this workbook to a SharePoint library. In order to do that, I'm going to do some preparation first just to clean things up a bit. Let's make it a little more presentable by applying perhaps a more attractive styling. This filter here, I'm going to embed this into a web part page. So I am going to use a filter web part to collect fiscal information. So I don't need to display this. But before I hide the rows, I'm going to go ahead and name this single cell to become year. And when we publish this to Excel services, I can indicate that that year will become a parameter to receive filter endpoints. And now I'm in a position where I can go ahead and hide these two rows. All right, to clean things up a little bit better, I come into the view. I can hide grid lines and head links as well. And it starts to look less and less by Excel at this point, right? So on the File ribbon tab, here I choose the option to save and send, save to SharePoint, and I have the publish options. And this is where we can control what Excel services will allow to be rendered and to also define parameters. So the choice to allow Excel services to render the entire workbook, selected sheets, or indeed just selected items. Today I'm just going to allow it to publish sheet 1. And then here on the parameters tab, I'm going to specify that year will be a parameter. Note that slices can also be used to receive values from other web parts too, but that's not appropriate in this demonstration. And so having configured the publish options, I'm ready to go ahead and publish this workbook to SharePoint. All right, so I'm going to navigate to my Excel reports library. And I think we'll choose this sales by product by country. And I'll choose not to open this with Excel in the browser immediately. Let me save it as the document first. If I leave this option on, it would automatically launch a browser window and then take me to the URL of that workbook and show me what it looks like. And I'm going to show you what it looks like coming from the other side. Aha, so we have success. So here I am as the end user now, navigating to the Excel reports library in this site. Now there's something special about this library. Because I have the Power Pivot add-in for SharePoint installed, this is what's known as the Power Pivot gallery. And because Power Pivot works with Excel services, it doesn't matter that Power Pivot's not part of the solution here. But what it will do is support this Silverlight representation with previews of all of the workbooks that are stored in the library. Now what we see here is this hourglass is actually saying that the snapshot service in the background, it's just done its job, is taking snapshots of the internals of the workbook. And where there are multiple reports, and those multiple reports could be worksheets or pivot tables or named ranges within the workbook, we can then preview them by hovering across here and then ultimately clicking to make a selection. And here we see, by URL, referencing the workbook in SharePoint, this report. And note the interactivity we have. These slices can be used to slice across the data. We can expand and collapse. Here on the row labels, we can sort and filter at the different levels of the hierarchy. Based on permissions, you may be allowed to download a copy of the workbook, reload the workbook. That will force Excel services to reload, requery, recalculate, and then the refresh capability also. So where I'm heading in this demonstration is that now we've published this, let's return to the dashboards library and introduce a new web part page. And this time I introduce the Excel Web Access web part. And to configure it, it's just a matter of referencing the workbook by URL. Where there are multiple items, I could select the particular item to show, but leaving that empty will show everything that's available. We won't auto-generate the web part title. I'll choose to turn off the toolbar that we saw earlier. You can disable functionality too. If you don't want to support sorting or filtering, you can control that here at the web part itself. And we'll call this sales by product. And then OK. And that's embedded the report into the web part page. And then from a web part point of view with the filter, you see I was pretty unimpressed with the first filter I showed you because hard coding years is probably not a great idea. I didn't have much choice because it was based off the SharePoint list. In this example, I'm going to base the filter off the same ODC file that the workbook was created from. So this time I choose a SQL Server Analysis Services filter. And to configure it, we'll come up with a good name for it. So I click here to reference the ODC file that we referenced earlier. And then we have the reseller sales. And now I have the ability to introduce any dimension hierarchy from the cube. So from my date dimension, we'll reference the fiscal hierarchy. And we'll make it about 150 pixels wide. So last step then is to create a connection to send its filter values to the sales by product web part. And remember the parameter that I defined? There it is there. Okay. So I've called it fiscal date. And I needed to fix this one here. And that should complete my dashboard page. So now users can come across and this is a multi-level hierarchy. Show me what's going on for November of 2009. Well, maybe we had no data in Australia, but in the United States, we certainly had data. Okay, so there's nothing to stop you building up a web part page that consists of multiple filters, multiple Excel Web Access web parts to bring together multiple reports and allow the slicing of that data through common filters that you add to the page. Moving on to performance point services, this is a service application there for performance management solutions, and it's about defining rich KPI and scorecard definitions to support the monitoring, to understand what's going on. It includes comprehensive report types to support analysis, to understand why things are going on. And it delivers all of this in interactive browser-based dashboards that are published to SharePoint. Dashboard solutions are based on 7 related elements, and so there's a little bit of theory to cover off on here first. Data sources connect to your business data stores, in this case the reseller sales cube. We can then define key performance indicators based off the measures in the cube. Indicators can be defined to provide representation graphically or through colors of how the different levels of the KPIs should be represented. And then ultimately these KPIs end up in scorecards. Scorecards can also be sliced and diced by data sources. We can add hierarchies to the columns and the rows of the scorecard itself, and this delivers the monitoring capabilities of the product. Now that's great for answering the questions, how are we going? Are we on track with sales? And particularly where we're not, the next obvious question that comes up is, why are we not on track? And this is where we can include reports that support the discovery of those answers to the questions. And this is the analytics capability of the product. Now we're at a point then that we deploy them to a dashboard, and we can also define filters that allow us to slice across the scorecards and reports that are embedded into the dashboard pages. So then let's see by demonstration. I have already defined a performance point data source that will connect to the reseller sales cube. And note that we have a performance point content list here where all of the other 6 elements, the KPIs, indicators, scorecards, reports, filters, and dashboards, their definitions will be stored. Now the concept of this is that we can store these individual definitions and promote their reuse by other projects that you have or with your colleagues. So we can define this KPI once and potentially embed it into multiple scorecards and multiple dashboards. So the development environment we have is Dashboard Designer. It's made available to end users through a click once deployment, which, providing they have permission, will download, install, and launch this Windows application for them. And what you'll note here in the Workspace browser is that it already has registered libraries that we have in our site. So there's the data connections library, and here's our performance point content list. So presently in our Workspace, we have no items. But it does tell us here on the server that there is a reseller sales data source available for us to use. And simply by double-clicking it, I'm now introducing it into my Workspace, and it's now available for me to build other items off. So I'm not going to modify the definition of this. I will come to the performance point content though, and I'll create a new scorecard. I'm actually taking a shortcut. Time doesn't permit me to spend much time on performance point today. Do note that I'll be talking about it end-to-end in a session on Wednesday. The shortcut that I'm taking is that the scorecard wizard supports, once you define a data source, the creation of KPIs, or if that data source is analysis services and your cube contains the KPIs, you can reference them and introduce them into your Workspace. So choosing the analysis services template and then basing the wizard off a data source of an analysis services cube. So here we have the reseller sales. I'm at this junction now. So do I create new KPIs from the measures that are available in this cube? Maybe. Okay, what it's trying to do, and it's just attempting the first time, is go ahead and read the metadata of the cube to provide a list of measures that are available. It's obviously still waking up. Okay, would you believe me if I said a list of measures turned up in that drop-down list? It's not my intention to do that anyway. It's really to import that KPI that we saw earlier in Excel. Recall that we have this KPI called sales performance. So let's leverage the definition that the cube developer has already baked into the cube in our performance point solution. So this time we'll import SQL Server Analysis Services KPIs, and here it is reading the metadata that describes the KPIs that we have. I import this. Personally, I don't like the word import because it says to me that it's actually copying the definition of the KPI into Performance Point. That's not the case. It is creating a KPI, but it is referencing through formula the KPI that is defined in the cube. In other words, if the cube developer changed the formula on how it computed variance or status, it would flow through via the queries that Performance Point services would query to understand what this KPI does. I have the ability to filter this KPI. Potentially I want this KPI to represent US sales performance. I choose to keep the definition wide open so I won't filter it. And then because this is the scorecard wizard, I could also add members across the columns, and I choose not to do that at this stage also. The KPI will be added to this list in SharePoint, and then when I click Finish, you'll note that 2 items are added to the workspace. Okay, the first is the sales performance KPI that's been imported from the cube, and the second is the scorecard. All right, so let's first draw our attention to the KPI itself. If you're familiar with analysis services and how it defines a KPI, it actually consists of 3 different metrics, or 4 in fact: value, goal, status, and trend. And so here it is importing those metrics to become the KPI in Performance Point services. Just point out to you here in the custom mappings, this is the way that it connects to the KPI through queries. It isn't copying the formula that defines how to receive the value. It's actually using the MDX function that is, get me the KPI value for the KPI with this name. And so all 4 metrics have similar functions that support that binding. What I will do here is format the numbers. So very easy to use window here to format the numbers of the value and the goal. And then for the goal itself, this is where we define the different levels and the thresholds. So the cube developer has told me and documented the fact that green status is 1, the yellow is 0, and red is -1. And likewise for trend. In fact, she told me that there's only 3 different possible states for trend: up, down, or no change, and 1, 0, and -1 map to those. And so that pretty much defines the KPI. Let me go ahead and save that. And I also want to point out to you that when I return to my site and take a look at the Performance Point content, these definitions are being saved directly back into this list. So let's draw our attention now to the scorecard itself. When I go ahead and update it, this is what it looks like. There's our value, goal and status, and trend metrics. I'm going to modify the metric that I have here to say that I don't need to see the value. That 1, 0, or -1 doesn't really make sense, nor a variance. All we want to see is the icon. And then from the resources here in the details pane, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the salesperson hierarchy. Watch when I drag and drop. Before I release the drag, I have the ability to say that the members of this hierarchy will become children of this KPI, or parents, or siblings above or below. So in this example, I will say, place those members beneath the KPI, and we could go ahead and select a static list of members, or I think much more interesting is auto-select. Let's select all descendants. And so dynamically what it does is produces this hierarchy that shows us by country, or group, country, region, and our employees. And now we can assess status of the sales performance. Okay, what I'm going to do is underline and make these blue as a bit of a hint to users that there's going to be a link going on there. And that completes the definition of the scorecard. Be careful not to interpret the values you see at this stage, because it's not filtering by a particular time period. It won't be until that scorecard's embedded into a dashboard and we configure a filter that we can then pass time periods across to the scorecard. So at this stage we can just inspect it and say that it looks, from a formatting point of view, about right. So right-clicking the list, we can now introduce the analytic capabilities with a report. And there are these different report templates. The 2 that I want to point out to you that I think are the most interesting are the analytic chart and analytic grid. They must be based off an analysis services data source. And why I think they're interesting is that they support very, very rich interactive experience in the browser, as I will demonstrate. So let's start with the analytic grid. Must be based off an analysis services data source, so we're referencing our reseller sales. And pretty much these are the resources of that cube. So I'm going to place the sales amount and some gross profit information here on the columns. And then we'll place the salesperson hierarchy here. And we can make a selection of what members that we want to show. And I'm just going to say, auto-select all the salespeople. Okay, I actually don't want the all member as well, so I turned it off. So now we have a list of all salespeople, what they sold, and profit margin information. Now, the background is where we can place other members to filter that you don't see in the report itself. And so what's important is that we're going to filter our dashboard by the fiscal hierarchy. Okay, so I need to include from my date dimension that fiscal hierarchy so it can receive filter endpoint values. I don't need to filter it by something here explicitly. It will become an endpoint that we'll pass values into later on. Okay, then I go ahead, rename this to become my salespeople report. And look at this, the query tab is showing us the MDX that was built to support this. There's no requirement to know MDX. If you do know it, you may modify this, but be aware that when you modify it, you're going to lose a lot of the rich interactivity that I'm going to demonstrate to you once I publish this dashboard. Okay, we're almost ready to produce the dashboard itself. The next thing to do is define a filter. So the filter that I'll define will be using member selection. We have the ability to use custom table based off tabular data sets. If you know your MDX, any set expression can be used as the available values of a filter. Name sets defined in the cube. And there are time intelligence capabilities that I'll talk about more on Wednesday. Very easy to produce things like year to date and parallel periods. Again, without the need to write queries, but using a simple time period specification language, using English constructs to come up with those types of time transformations. So basing this filter on the member selection and the reseller sales data source, I simply select the dimension, which is my fiscal hierarchy. And again, I can auto-select members, but I'm pretty much going to say, select all descendants. And then because it's a multi-level hierarchy, I'll represent this as a tree. And then we'll call this the fiscal date filter. Okay, there's one more thing that I want to do actually. One more report. Excel services. So our efforts in defining the report that I created earlier. So let me copy this site. So in this site, in my Excel reports library, I can now choose the sales by product by country. And note the parameter here of year. Good planning. Remember that I created that parameter on the fiscal date hierarchy. That's going to work well because my filter in performance point is going to allow me to pass into it. Okay, so all I need to do is save this off as my rename sales by product by country. And now I'm ready to assemble this dashboard. Okay, right-click on the list, new dashboard. Pretty much what you're producing is the layout of a web part page. So I'm going to go for the header with 2 columns. This will be the template for the first page in my dashboard. And I'll call this the main page. And then what I'm going to do is, from the resources here in my workspace, is drag the fiscal date filter into the header, my scorecard into the left column, and this report, the salespeople report, here into the right. Okay, so what's left to finalize this page is pretty much to wire up the connections about what flows where. So generally speaking, filters can pass values out to scorecards and reports, and scorecards can pass values out to reports. Reports can only consume from either scorecards or filters. So it's a matter of then saying, in this case, that the fiscal date's member unique name, and I simply drop this into the scorecard, and I want it to filter at page level. So whatever the selection is in the filter will slice across the scorecard. We can do more interesting things by passing these members onto the different axes of the scorecards. So you can come up with some really sophisticated arrangements that selections in filters can actually reformat the layout of the scorecard. Likewise, we'll pass that member unique name into the report. So remember, I added that to the background of the report, and that's how it becomes something that can be connected to. And then what I'm going to do is take the member unique name from the row members. So recall on my scorecard that we have the salesperson hierarchy here. So I have this ability then to come back to the dashboard and say, well, the selection of a member on the rows will also pass into here, and we'll pass that into that salespeople hierarchy. Let's add a second page. I'll also drop in the fiscal date to it, and I'll call this product analysis. I'm going to delete the right zone. So we've just got this one big, I'll stop calling it the left column, I'll just call it the body. And into it, I will drop that Excel services report. And then I can pass that the member unique name from my filter passes into the year parameter of the Excel services report. So I've just constructed a two-page dashboard, reusing the filter on both pages. First page, scorecard and analytic grid report. The second being the Excel services report. Let me rename this to become the AdventureWorks Sales Monitoring, and save. So the last step then is that dashboards go through a deployment process. Essentially what the deployment does is, to the nominated library in your site, it will create a folder, and then for each dashboard page, it will create a web part page, and it will produce the output according to the configuration you have here. So that's now deploying the dashboard to SharePoint, and then it's taking us automatically here in Internet Explorer to the dashboard page. So let's take a look. Here in the filter, I'm going to say, show me Q4 of 2010. And then we can see the different results here at group, country, and so on. One thing that I would like to do is come back to my scorecard, and here on settings is show the toolbar. And so simply by saving this definition back to the server and then reloading the dashboard page, I've got it. All right, so now I can do things like collapse everything, allow it to explore what's going on in North America. And notice the selection of North America then shows me the North American salespeople. Well, I'm supposed to be the salespeople, but there they are. All right, so we can monitor and we can analyze over here in the grid. And so some very cool things here when we're monitoring and analyzing is the ability to then drill across. So for North America, I'm interested in the breakdown by category. So appreciate this is in a web browser. There's nothing needed to be installed except perhaps Internet Explorer and permission to get to this page. And then go ahead and filter out empty rows. And maybe I'm interested in other metrics. Show me other measures from this cube. And I'm interested in details about this 232. And there's the individual rows that you could potentially export into Excel for further analysis. Power Pivot could be something you'd like to use here to then build up a model based on this some set of data. Or perhaps I want to look at this graphically. So what often helps is to open this in a new window, gives you more real estate. And then we get the toolbar and I can switch it across to the analytic grid. Okay, and then we can hover over the bars. And if this is of interest, let's right-click and analyze this in a decomposition tree. Now this requires Silverlight, and this visualization then allows us to drill down and across and look at the different paths. So let's break this down by the different months that we have, and let's see what happened in May. Where did we sell this? What resellers? And then if I want to sort, and I can do this, if I want to analyze this at grid level, then I can open up a grid and then just continue to analyze. This is very, very impressive. And so what I say to my customers is that even if you don't think Performance Point is what you're looking for right now, we're not ready for KPIs and scorecards, don't worry about that part of the product. If you have a cube already deployed, just creating analytic grid and chart reports and publishing them to dashboards is a really effective way of allowing this web-based browser experience of exploring across the data. Page 2, product analysis. Note the carry forward of our filter selection, and we have the reuse of the Excel services report here and the ability then to explore what was going on in Canada for our product. So it supplements the dashboard experience. Okay, that's Performance Point services. Moving on next to Visio services. So you may well be familiar with Visio as being part of the Office productivity tool set, allowing you to diagram. So this service in SharePoint supports central access to and browser-based rendering of Visio diagrams. And diagrams can be based on refreshable data sources. We can use them for bringing diagrams to life with data-driven visuals that are connected to real-time data. And we can share interactive browser-based diagrams. So appreciate that it supports connecting to SQL Server data, and that's the relational engine, not analysis services, SharePoint list data, Excel services reports, and any OLADB or ODB sources that you care to configure and register. There is a Visio Web Access web part that supports the embedding of the diagram into web part pages. So by demonstration, I already have a pre-configured diagram. All right. So these are the servers of Contoso, consisting of 5 different servers, domain controller, file server, and so on. And what we've done also is that we have a SharePoint list that includes an item for each server and a column that provides status of online, who the admin is, and some other statistics. So what we're going to do is bring this diagram to life by connecting it to the SharePoint list data. So just to appreciate some basics about Visio, that we have shapes, and that shapes can also have collections of data assigned to them. So these particular shapes that come with the product include these properties. And you'll note that I've already set the network name. So DC1 we have for the second shape. This is file to email 3 and so on. Here on the data ribbon tab, link data to shapes. We have these options to connect to data. Just note that access is not supported by Visio services. SharePoint list. And these are the lists available in the site. And so there's the Contoso server status. And then it adds that data into the document itself. So the next step then is to create a relationship between the rows in the data source and the shapes in your diagram. And this can be facilitated by using the automatically link command. So for all shapes on this page, link according to where the server matches the network name property. So the fact that I'd already prepared the shapes and included means it will automatically, as you see here, link the rows to the shapes. So the next step is to bring this diagram to life by doing something with this data. So the data graphics here, I'm going to create a new one. And a data graphic is a collection of items that allow us to visualize the different properties that we have. And so I'm going to choose we'll choose the server. And I'm going to display this as text and overlay it on top of the shape. And I'm going to use heading 3. And instead of the default position, I want it located center and above the shape. And I'll modify the font to about size 16. Okay, so let me select all of those shapes and then apply that. And you can see the way that that data has flowed through with the text label. So one other item that I do want to add, so I'll edit this data graphic, a new item, this time based on the status. Remember that status was either online or offline. And we're going to use the color by value. So if it's online, it will be red. Nothing's presently offline. Actually, online will be green, right? Usually. And then offline will be the red. And automatically everything's green, as we'd expect because everything's online. Okay, I'm ready now to publish this. This is the trick. Here on Files, Save and Send, Save to SharePoint, it must be saved as a web drawing. Visio services will not load a Visio drawing, so we must choose this format. And then I'll select Save As. Okay, I don't want to save it to the Excel reports. Let's just move up one. And I have a library here called Visio Web Drawings. So I'm happy to call it Contoso Servers. I do have options here that allow me to configure what data sources are refreshable by Visio services. And if I have a multi-page document, I can also specify that only certain pages can be rendered by Visio services as well. Okay, I'm going to leave them both on because I want a live data source here as I'll demonstrate to you. So we'll go ahead and save that. Oops. Believe me, it's not usually this slow. It's only when you have to demonstrate. A lot of cool stuff is going on now. So it's actually changing the format of the document to XAML. So it's going to be vector-based. And you'll see that what gets rendered through the browser-based capabilities of Visio services is crisp and clear. So it's transforming it in preparation for what Visio services will require. And there we go. And automatically, and there was a checkbox that I left checked, it's going and opening up that document for me using this Visio Web Access page. Essentially, this is a full-size Visio Web Access web part. So similar to the Excel Web Services story where you can embed the Excel Web Access web part into web part pages, you can do likewise with the Visio documents. So you have the ability to open in Visio, refresh, navigate between the different pages of the document, zoom, pan, resize. By default, it doesn't trust the fact that there are data sources. I'm going to say enable those data sources. The selection of a shape does allow me to open up and look at the different properties we have of the shape. Also, we could define hyperlinks to link to other resources, and they'd be accessible from here. But where I'm going to go with this is, I'm going to return and update the status of our database server and make it offline. And now when I return to the Visio diagram, a refresh of this shows us it's offline. Now the web part includes a property that supports auto refresh. So you could have this as a non-interactive experience. This dashboard page is just every minute refreshing according to the underlying data. Okay, that's Visio services. We then move on to reporting services integration. So hopefully you're familiar with what Circular Server reporting services can do for you. It's a huge topic in its own right. This is really talking about how we can integrate reporting services with a SharePoint farm and specifically enable end-user reporting using Report Builder 3.0. So similar to the dashboard designer story where we have a click-once deployment of a Windows application to the client, Report Builder 3.0 is the same story. That those that require reporting can launch Report Builder 3.0 and have an extremely rich experience for producing comprehensive, sophisticated, professional-looking reports. You can then save those reports back to SharePoint libraries. Management and delivery functions are available within the interface, so all of the functionality you may well be familiar with in the native mode using Report Manager is surfaced also in SharePoint, with the additional benefits, because the definitions are stored in document libraries, that you have collaboration, workflow, and versioning capabilities within SharePoint. There's also a SQL Server reporting services web part that supports the embedding of reporting services reports into web part pages, and the filters that I've demonstrated can pass into the report parameters of the reports. So in demonstration, I've already launched Report Builder 3.0. So what I have before me here is a blank report, and I start by just removing the title. And what I'm then going to do is use, from the Insert ribbon tab, a wizard to insert a map. Now it launches the new map wizard. The good news is if you come from the United States, we include a map gallery like this. So what I'm going to do is produce a report that shows the sales by state graphically or spatially through color in the states. Next, I have the ability then to zoom and configure how I want that to look. If I had internet service connectivity, then I could add a big map layer that would overlay a road or aerial or hybrid view of the big map service. Next, I'm going to say this is an analytic map that will allow me to bring in data and represent it within the shapes of my map. And I'm going to add a data set that includes fields that are related to the spatial data. When I click Next, I have the ability then to browse down to my connection library and introduce the pre-created data source that administrators have created, approved, and secured. So sitting in this library here, I have a data source for that sales analysis cube. And again, without the need to know any MDX to query this multidimensional structure, I get this graphical design experience. And so I'm going to come into my reseller and its geography and say, put state in here. I'm interested in looking at the sales. I'm not interested in the Australian states, so let's take that same geography hierarchy and filter only by the United States. So essentially, if you're interested to know, you can switch across and say, there's the MDX required to produce this 2-column result. Okay, now the other thing that I want to do is support the filtering by time. So I bring in my fiscal hierarchy, and this isn't very obvious, but when you scroll to the very right, you can expose that to become a report parameter. And that does several things. It adds the report parameter, but also produces a hidden data set to support the available values. In other words, the hierarchy members that users can use in a drop-down list to select the time period that they want to analyze. Now this part of the wizard then is saying to me that of the spatial data you have, there are all of these polygons with these properties of a number, a state code, and a state name. We don't get to see a preview of our data because it's being driven by a parameter, so it can't actually run it until there's some user interactivity. But I can tell it that if you match the state field from my data set to this column, that's how it can relate the data in my data set to the shapes in the map. And how will it represent those? Well, I want it to put the sum of sales amount to represent the sales in a state. And I'm going to change the color rule from light to dark. So the fewer sales, the lighter the color, the more sales, relatively, will have a darker shaded state. I could overlay the state code, but that gets a little bit too cluttered, so I have a better way of dealing with that. I'm going to click Finish. That completes the report, so I'm just going to say this is US sales by state. I'm going to choose to hide the distance scales and the legends. I have a better approach, that for each polygon I can come to the properties and build up a tooltip. And my tooltip is going to say this, that when a user hovers over a state, go and reveal from the fields of my data set what the name of the state will be, put a carriage return line feed in there, and then the sales. Format as a number the sales amount to 0 decimal places. One last thing that I'm going to do, and you'll note on the view that the properties is hidden. For IT professionals, it's there by default. It's sort of assumed that the IWs don't need to get to this level, but if they need to, it's there. My intention is to come in and say that if we export the data from this map as a feed, right, it's a little advanced, but it's going to support my next demonstration with PowerPivot, then I want to use the state field as the label for each polygon, so that this one is California, this one's Texas. So I'm just configuring that in preparation for exposing this data as a feed shortly. And then here on the Home ribbon tab, when I click Run, we get to preview the report. Eventually. Okay, so here is our report filter. Simply by checking that checkbox in the filter pane in that graphic query designer, we have the ability to come in here and say, well, show me what was going on for, let's just say, fiscal year 2010, quarter 2. Let's view the report. And now we see it spatially represented through the map of the USA. Of course, time permitting, this report could be embedded into my Performance Point dashboard. Its filter is based off the same filter that the PPS dashboard was using. So I can add a third page very easily, embed this, and away we go. And note when I hover over a state, there's its name, there's the details about it. On top of that, time permitting, I love the fact you can click on these polygons and actions can drill through to other reports. So this can be an exploratory experience if you want to develop the report to do so. So where I'm heading with this, I'm simply going to save it, not down to the file system, but to my SSRS reports library. I'm going to share this with everybody else. US sales by state. And at this point, if I navigate to that library, this report's available for other people. Simply clicking this link is going to engage reporting services to execute that report and be rendered for us in the browser. And then providing I have permission, I could subscribe to this, or I could modify its parameters or cache the data behind it and so on. Last topic, in enabling business intelligence with SharePoint 2010, the story of PowerPivot. I don't have a lot of time to talk about PowerPivot, and I wish that I did. But the story is like this. We're pretty much enabling end users using Excel to create very sophisticated models, potentially off very large sets of data, and to enrich them with calculations and to build interactive reports, similar to what we've seen already with Excel services. So pivot table reports, pivot charts, there are cube functions that provide a great deal of control over customizing the layout of a report. Now the story is that when you save that workbook, what happens is not just the workbook data and metadata is saved, but the PowerPivot model is actually embedded inside that workbook. The second part of the story then is if you take that workbook and publish it to SharePoint, and SharePoint has the Power Pivot add-in for SharePoint installed and configured, then requests for that workbook will engage Excel services to load the workbook, query the data sources. Now at that point, when it looks at the data sources of the workbook, it will learn that there is an embedded data source that is Power Pivot. And so that will engage the Power Pivot service to take that embedded model, effectively it's a backup, restore it to an instance of analysis services. Excel services then queries that model and then goes ahead, recalculates, renders the workbook and sends it down to the client. So effectively, Power Pivot is enabling end users themselves to produce these models that can be published and then become data sources for other experiences. Simply by the URL of that workbook, reporting services can access it, Performance Point can access it, other Excel workbooks can connect to that model hosted in SharePoint. So let's take a look by demonstration. All right, so here's my report, sales by state. And I look at this and I say, well, that's really interesting, but I wish I had the data because what I want to do is analyze it further. I need to look at sales and understand what's going on per capita. What's our penetration per state? So let me choose, for example, fiscal year 2010. And there's the data, and I look at that and go, well, that's great, but I need to analyze this. Well, up here, we can export this as a data feed. And by opening the Atom service document, what you'll discover is that the behavior here on the client is then to engage Excel and Power Pivot to consume that feed. Eventually. No? There we go. Okay, so it's opened up the Power Pivot window and it's launched the table import wizard. What's here is the URL to, indirectly, to that report. So I'm going to call this my sales by state. Click Next. There could be multiple data regions in my report. So each data region could be an independent feed. So the next part of this wizard says, well, what feeds do you want to bring into Power Pivot? Well, there's only one called Map1, so I'm just going to call this sales. The preview and filter lets me take a look at the data, and also the ability to remove columns that are not of interest to me in this model. So this is what's going on in the background. Power Pivot is communicating with that feed that is really reporting services, and reporting services is executing the report and querying the underlying data source to bring this through. So I don't need this column here, the fiscal year, that's my filter value. But I do want the state and the associated sales. So then I click Finish, and that data is now imported and is the first table within my model. I could have gone straight to the cube, by the way, but that's less interesting. All right, I'll just point out to you here, on the ribbon, the From database, I could have connected direct to analysis services, and with exactly the same graphic query designer that we had in Report Builder 3.0, I could have constructed the same query. Okay, but this user didn't know that. All right, 35 rows have been imported. Obviously, we're not selling in 15 of the US states. And what you'll note down here is we have a table called sales. We're just going to do a little cleanup here. I'm going to rename this to become called state. This one here will be called sales. Now also, because it's feed data, it doesn't understand that this is numeric, so I'm going to change this to become a whole number. Okay, now I want to introduce from a different data source population information, and it just so happens in my SharePoint site that I have US population from the census in 2008. Gone to the effort of loading it into this list. All right, so when I come to the list itself, look at this, I can export as a data feed. And again, opening the Atom service document, thinking about it. Let me close that. Still thinking about it. There we go. Where are you? No, I don't want that. Let's try that again. Export as a data feed. Open. What I expect to see is a dialog window that comes up to say, haha, do you want to create a new Excel workbook, or does this feed get imported into an existing workbook? No, it just doesn't want to play nice. So you know what, we can get to it the other way. Let's copy the URL. It's attempting to import it into a new workbook. This is not what I want. Cancel. Close. Workbook 2, no. So I have one workbook open. Let's try this again. Just doesn't want to do it. It wants to give it to me in a new workbook. Well, let's play by its rules for the minute. Next. Bring in that population. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of trickery here. So let's bring in the state and its population. Power Pivot supports copy and paste, fortunately. So what I'm able to do once it's imported into my second workbook, this is not what I planned to do, but with the 2 minutes 40 seconds I have left, I can take this, copy, switch across to here, and paste. And this will become population. All right, so let's just assume it worked as it's supposed to. Let's ensure that population is also a whole number. And even though these are from different sources, I can create relationships to say that the state in this sales table relates to the state in the population table. And now I can switch across to Excel, and I can introduce a pivot table off it. So let's take a look at this. I want state, sales, and population. X. So it needs a relationship, quick. But we created a relationship. State, population. It won't matter that there's more states in one than the other. It will still do a match. Just making sure that that's a whole number. That's a whole number. What I'm going to do in the 1 minute 11 seconds I have, go to the related table and give me from population what its population is. So now they're side by side in the one table. I'll just rename this to become population. And then in my population table, I will tell it, go and hide everything from the pivot table. So all we now see is this, state, sales, and population. Haha, that works. And then I'm going to introduce a measure that's going to allow me to divide one by the other. Sales per capita. And then I can say, give me sum of sales and divide it by sum of population. And we format this. I've now introduced these different data sources, retrieved data from a report, from a SharePoint list, brought it together in a single model. Where the story would end up is really what I've just demonstrated with Excel services, is I could then publish this, and the only difference really is that the Excel services side of the story is going to engage the Power Pivot service to take the model, restore it to analysis services, and then render that back. Very quickly, because I'm just out of time, is that when we look at the Power Pivot gallery here, we have then the ability, if I had time to publish it, to create new workbooks that connect to this and query it, to create reporting services reports based off this model. We would then use the analysis services graphic query designer to create reports from it, and to configure data refresh. So the feeds could be refreshed according to a recurring schedule configured by the end user themselves. Okay, so that's the Power Pivot story. Hopefully if there's interest there, there'll be sessions you can really get up to speed with on this. Okay, so integration with Power Pivot is it provides centralized storage, data refresh and management of workbooks, uses Excel services to achieve this, complements traditional analysis services implementation by supporting the creation of end user models that can connect to a more diverse range of data stores. And finally, IT have the ability to monitor usage and server utilization of the service itself. So that's brought me to the end of the demonstrations. Just want to make a note that if you're interested to follow through on any of these topics, there's likely to be hands-on labs that have been built around Power Pivot, Performance Point, and so on. So there's an opportunity for first-hand experience. Heaps of breakout sessions related to SharePoint BI this week. Visio services, Performance Point, I'll be covering on Wednesday. Dashboard creation. Interactive sessions that will cover off on these topics as well. And as I've just mentioned, the hands-on labs. So thanks very much for your time and attendance, and please don't forget to fill in the evaluation. Thank you.